The movie begins by recounting the story of a happy family. Nikki and Helen live a quiet life with their two children. The eldest, Brendan, who truly loves hockey, and Lucas, the younger, who is more interested in art. Recently, Brendan has been playing hockey increasingly well, even receiving an award as the best player on his high school team, which makes him feel very happy and fills his family with pride. Meanwhile, Nikki is absorbed in his work, yet he still lives happily and peacefully. Although his children sometimes have minor quarrels, they love each other. That night, with a game ahead, his father takes Brendan to the match. During the game, Nikki celebrates every goal his son scores. Afterwards, once home, Brendan tells his father that he plans to go to Canada to take his hockey skills to another level. This excites Nikki because he trusts his son and believes that he will achieve everything he sets his mind to. Suddenly, some cars speed by, frightening them both. At that moment, their car runs out of fuel, and they must stop at a nearby gas station to refuel. Nikki takes care of refueling, while Brendan decides to go into the store to buy something. Just then, Nikki calls his wife to share the news about his son. Soon after, the passengers from the cars that had scared them a few moments earlier appear. They get out and enter the store with the intention of robbing it, and they immediately kill the owner. At that moment, one of the thugs, a new member of the group, must pass a test, which consists of choosing someone on the spot and killing them. The chosen victim is Brendan. However, the young thug hesitates and becomes petrified. In the end, he slits his throat with his machete, leaving Nikki traumatized as he witnessed everything from outside. Immediately, Nikki tries to apprehend the murderer while the others escape. He tackles the young man and manages to remove his mask, but the thug manages to flee. However, he is hit by a car while trying to escape. Meanwhile, Nikki returns to his son and rushes him to the hospital, though it is already too late. The next day, the protagonist must go to the police station to identify the murderer. There, he recognizes a 23-year-old man named Joe. Following that, the funeral for his son takes place. The parents are overwhelmed with deep sorrow throughout the day, and Lucas bursts into tears every time he thinks of his brother. That afternoon, Helen asks her husband to do something so that the murderer of their son is condemned to life imprisonment. The next morning, Nikki visits Detective Wallace and the district attorney, who inform him that Joe will receive a light sentence because there wasn't enough evidence. Since the gas station's security camera was ruined, there is no record. This infuriates Nikki, and his rage grows even more when he learns that the reason his son was murdered was so that Joe could join a gang. On the day of the hearing, the judge asked Nikki to testify about how Joe murdered his son. However, Nikki denies that it was the young man who committed the crime, claiming that it was too dark to clearly see the murderer's face, which leaves everyone astonished. Faced with this revelation, the judge dismisses the case, releasing Joe, who steps out smoking his cigarette. At that moment, the gang arrives and welcomes him into the group. Even Billy, the gang leader, tells him that he is proud of him, while Nikki watches everything from a distance. Then Joe is rewarded with a prostitute and a wad of cash, which further deepens the protagonist's disappointment. That same night, Nikki searches for a weapon. Afterward, he tells his family that the young man was released for lack of evidence and that he must go to his office because he forgot something. In truth, he is going to look for Joe. Shortly after, Joe encounters Nikki, who attacks him. They fight for a moment, but during the struggle, Joe is stabbed with a knife. Upon seeing the blood, the protagonist is extremely frightened, so he takes the bloody knife and discards it in a remote place. Next, Nikki returns home, where Helen discovers that he has an injured hand, which worries her. The two then break down in tears while Nikki recalls that he is now not only a victim, but also a murderer. On the other hand, Billy goes to see Bones, his boss, and hands him the money obtained from the robbery. Bones scolds him because the amount is less than expected. Then Billy returns to the gang's base, where they cook methamphetamines. There, one of his companions informs him about Joe's death, which enrages Billy even further. Soon after, Detective Wallace visits Nikki and informs him that the murderer of his son is dead, directing her gaze toward Nikki's hand with intrigue, assuming that it is related to the incident. Meanwhile, Billy's gang is celebrating Joe, as they considered him a good soldier. At that moment, Billy arrives and scolds them for not showing respect to Joe. They then begin working, investigating which rival gangs could be responsible. Just then, one of the gang members reveals that his sister saw a man in a suit that night. Consequently, they show his sister a newspaper photo of Nikki, and she confirms that he is the man she saw. Shortly after, Nikki is seen selling his hand again on the street, not noticing that he is being followed, while Billy observes from a distance. Suddenly, just before one of the gang members can shoot him, the protagonist uses his suitcase to disarm the attacker. Upon witnessing this, Billy and his men begin chasing him through the streets, shooting from behind and frightening bystanders. Not long after, Nikki reaches an alley where he must discard his suitcase to flee more quickly. Next, he enters a parking lot and activates car alarms at random to mislead his pursuers. Finally, he reaches the rooftop of a building and finds himself trapped in a car with one of the men he was fighting, until miraculously, the car moves backward and he manages to escape in time. However, the other man is not as lucky and falls several meters until he crashes onto the ground. After this, Nikki receives a call from his wife informing him that Lucas has disappeared. Meanwhile, Detective Wallace arrives at the crime scene and discovers that the victim is another member of Joe's gang, making it clear that Nikki is behind these events. The protagonist then finds Lucas at the place where Brendan was killed. There, the boy argues with his father because he always felt that while his father was always attentive to Brendan, he never paid attention to him. Nonetheless, at that point, Nikki is solely concerned with Lucas's safety, so he immediately takes him home, where Helen greets him with a hug and begs him never to leave the house without informing anyone. The next morning, one of the gangsters shows up at Nikki's office, returns his suitcase, and threatens him, saying he has the right to know how he will be killed. At that moment, a guard enters and escorts the gangster out. After this, Nikki opens his suitcase and sees a photo of his family. The gangster's message is clear. He intends to kill Nikki's family, but not Nikki himself. When Nikki turns the photo over, he discovers a phone number, which he decides to call. It apparently belongs to Billy, who tells him that he has bought a death sentence for his family, since it turns out that Joe was his brother. When the call ends, Nikki immediately calls home to warn his wife and son of the danger. Shortly afterward, the detective calls him to inform him of what has happened, and he rushes home to secure all the windows. After a short while, Detective Wallace arrives and tells Nikki that he is to blame for taking justice into his own hands and that his family is now in danger. The detective then asks him to confess that he killed Joe. However, Nikki refuses that night while everyone is asleep. The loud noise of a car alarm wakes Nikki, who immediately realizes that the two officers guarding them are now dead. Suddenly, the gangsters begin invading the house, and fortunately, the protagonist manages to dodge several shots fired at him. He also wounds one of the gangsters and brutally injures some of them, but everything comes to an end when Nikki's family is captured by the gang and later assassinated by Billy, who shoots Helen, Lucas, and Nikki. A few days later, we see that Nikki wakes up in a hospital bed, feeling truly guilty for the death of his wife. He is then told that Lucas did not die but is in a coma. Nikki rushes to his son and apologizes for not being a good father. Moments later, when the detective goes to speak with a man, she notices that he has escaped through the window. Meanwhile, Nikki returns to his house, which is now a crime scene, and the next day he goes to the bank and withdraws all the money he had saved in his family account, since now he no longer has a family. After that, he goes to the meeting place of a gang, thanks to information provided by a coworker. There, he asks the bartender about the gang and offers to pay him a large sum of money in exchange for information. However, the bartender ignores him and even insults him, which causes Nikki to beat him in a fit of rage, as well as a man who tried to intervene. In the end, Nikki obtains information about Billy's whereabouts and also the address of Bones, from whom he can acquire weapons. Not long after, Nikki arrives at someone's house who initially shows little interest, but upon seeing a bag full of money, changes his mind and hands over several weapons, even a shotgun. Then Nikki gathers everything. Just as he is about to leave, Bones reveals that Billy and Joe are his sons and that he knows Nikki plans to kill Billy. Despite this, Bones warns Nikki that he won't succeed and lets him go. Later, the protagonist goes home and checks all his weapons. After that, he shaves his head and finally goes to Brendan's room, where he takes a jacket his son wore on the day of his death. After this, he heads to the gang's hideout and manages to get inside. Soon, he breaks down the door with his shotgun frightening one of the gangsters who was there, since that man had thought Nicky was dead. Inside, the man throws out a girl who was present and points his gun at a gangster's neck, demanding to know where Billy is. The gangster tells him to call Billy, who quickly realizes that Nicky is alive. Shortly after, the protagonist shoots the gangster. Then Bones meets with Billy and warns him that things are getting out of control and that he should stop fighting Nicky. However, Billy does not listen and even shoots Bones mercilessly, killing him. Elsewhere, Nicky sneaks in through the entrance of the hideout and kills one of the gangsters before he can react. He then enters the building and ends up killing the gang members one by one until only Billy remains. Billy approaches Nicky thinking he has no more weapons and tells him that he is now one of them. In response, Nicky pulls a weapon from his pocket and kills Billy. After this, Nicky returns home and watches an old family video while waiting to be arrested. At that moment, Detective Wallace arrives and tells him that Lucas has started to show movement. She fears that over time, Lucas might become a gangster due to everything that has happened and now that he will be left without a family. Confronted with this, the desolate protagonist feels deep sorrow as he thinks that everything is lost.
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.